Hey there, and welcome to another one of our Brexit Explained videos. This one's going to be on the Irish border issue, and more specifically, on how it could be solved. Before I start, I wanted to update you on our merch vote. Last week, we asked you to pick a country to add to our Countries with Shoes collection. We asked you to tweet in your answers, and we said we'd make whichever came first. The top choice was Ireland, rather appropriately for this video. You can now buy that design, as well as all of our other merch, over at teespring.com/stores/TLDR. For the first 6 hours after this video goes up, you can use promo code BORDER to get 10% off anything on our merch store. But that will only work until 3 PM on June 3rd, so make sure you're quick. The link is in the description. So if you're at all interested in Brexit, and given that you're watching this channel, you probably are, then you probably heard quite a lot about the Irish border. However, if you're anything like me, while you know it's causing a major headache for Brexiteers, you'll probably zone out when people start nattering on the specifics of checks and technological solutions. In this video, we're going to try and explain all of this, and figure out whether or not this problem can be solved. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, a bit of background. As we all know by now, one of the main advantages of Brexit is that it means the UK can do its own trade deals around the world. In very simple terms, when countries do trade deals, they lower tariffs on each other's goods, so they can sell to other countries' customers at a more competitive price, and they usually harmonise regulations. This is so that, let's say, health regulations in one country guarantee the same standards that are required by another country. This would mean, for example, that the same medicine could be sold in both countries without any reformulation or repackaging. So if the UK wants to be able to do its own trade deals, it needs to be able to diverge from the EU's tariffs and regulations, and create its own rules. If the UK is to diverge from the EU like this, it needs to establish where the border is between the UK and the EU. Just quickly to explain why this is, let's imagine that the UK finally does its long-awaited trade deal with the US. US products can now come into the UK tariff-free, and the UK harmonises its food regulations to allow always controversial chlorinated chicken to be sold in UK supermarkets. Let's say that at the same time the EU is in a trade war with the US, with massive tariffs on US goods, and chlorinated chicken doesn't meet the EU's health standards. If there's no border between the UK and EU, US producers who want to sell to the EU without paying tariffs or respecting its food regulations can just ship them tariff and border free to the UK, then border free into the EU, essentially using the UK as a backdoor to the EU. That's why a border is needed somewhere between the UK and the EU. Just so we're clear, this border isn't going to limit movement between Ireland and the UK. Both are signed up to the Common Travel Area, and that actually predicates the EU. So there's essentially two ways that this issue can be solved. The UK can either put its border up the Irish Sea, or on the island of Ireland between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Right, I've said Ireland too many times already, so let's look at the first option very quickly. So the UK could, hypothetically, decide to put its border in the Irish Sea. This was in effect the EU's original proposal, way back in 2017. They recommended keeping Northern Ireland in a customs union, which means that Northern Ireland would keep the same external tariffs and regulatory alignment with the EU, in order to avoid a border on the island of Ireland. While it's not common knowledge, there are already some sanitary and phytosanitary checks on goods going between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. All live animals entering Northern Ireland from Great Britain have to enter through the port of Larne, for example, so that they can be processed through a border inspection post. And anyone arriving in Northern Ireland who's been in contact with livestock in Britain has to declare themselves to officials upon arrival at a Northern Irish airport or ferry terminal to prevent and trace diseases. So the argument goes, why not just throw in a few more checks as well? This plan of splitting down the Irish Sea was never going to fly for one big reason. The DUP. The U in DUP stands for Unionists, and therefore the DUP's raison d'etre is to keep Northern Ireland part of the Union, that is, the United Kingdom. So there's no way they would ever accept more checks between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. They feared that this approach would eventually lead to the annexation of Northern Ireland and the reunification of Ireland, as the UK and Northern Ireland diverged further and further apart. Given the amount of political power that the DUP carry in this parliament, there was never actually any chance of this happening. Even if the DUP weren't so powerful, there's another major reason why this probably wouldn't have happened. The majority of Northern Ireland voted to remain in the EU, so in some sense letting them stay would be the most democratic thing to do. However, Scotland also primarily voted to stay in the EU, by an even bigger margin, and the Conservatives were worried that the Scots might turn around and ask to stay in the EU too, if they let Northern Ireland stay. Anyway, this leaves the Irish border with only one other option. Since the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, and don't worry, we're planning on coming back to this in a separate video, there have been no checks on the Irish border. It's basically just an imaginary line. It's about 300 miles long, and there are around 275 crossing points. The border is crossed 118,000 times a day, with about 6,000 of those being heavy goods vehicles. This has meant that the Irish and Northern Irish economies are very interconnected. The trade between the two is worth about £2.5 billion a year, and about 23,000 people commute across this border every day. To avoid violating the Good Friday Agreement, any new border can't have physical infrastructure. This was reaffirmed in December 2017 in a joint report produced by the UK and EU, which commits to, and I quote, avoiding physical infrastructure and related checks. So basically, somehow they need to come up with a border without a border. So if neither of these hard borders work, what else could the UK and EU do? The first solution to this was Maes Customs Partnership, which was included in her original Chequers proposal, and was more recently revived in her New Deal. Basically, the idea was that the UK would collect customs duties on behalf of the EU and vice versa. So going back to the world where the UK has a trade deal with the US, a US company would send its goods to the UK, and if the final destination of those goods was the EU, then the UK would collect tariffs and send that money onto the EU. Then the shipment would be sent on its way. The EU wouldn't need to do another check as it passed through the Irish border, because they know that it would have already paid its EU customs duties when it originally entered the UK, meaning no hard border would be necessary. If a US shipment entered the EU but was intended for the UK, then the company would just say so, and they wouldn't have to pay any EU tariffs at all, because of the UK-US trade deal. Unfortunately, this plan was rubbished by the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, almost immediately after it came out, for two main reasons. Firstly, it's super complicated. What about shipments where half the stuff is intended for the EU and half to the UK? It requires a whole load of new infrastructure for both the UK and EU that allows them to properly monitor which goods are intended for where. But secondly, and more importantly, EU law prevents third countries from collecting tariffs on their behalf. Furthermore, even if the EU accepted it, it doesn't allow for regulatory divergence, meaning that the UK would still have to follow the same regulations as the EU, which is a bit of a deal breaker for many Brexiteers. So the second solution, which is a bit more in vogue, is to use technology. The authoritative work on this subject, published by the EU, is by a guy called Lars Carlson, who's the director of the World's Customs Organization. He's got an impressive CV with a lot of experience in this area, so his word carries serious political weight. So let's take a look at what he wrote. The first thing that border technology would have to do would be to make sure that small and large businesses could cross the border without delay, so that the Irish economy could keep running smoothly. For larger businesses, Carlson recommends applying for Authorised Economic Operator, or AEO status. This is an internationally recognised standard for companies that can ensure that A, what's said to be in a container is really in the container, and B, their employees won't tamper with these goods. For smaller businesses, which make up about 80% of cross-border traffic, the UK would ask the EU for exemptions to allow them to travel across the border without being checked, if they're registered with the relevant authority. Customs duties could then be collected electronically. Before the journey, you say what you're going to bring into the EU and pay the correct customs duties. To make sure the driver doesn't change what's actually in the containers, the driver will also be registered to a trusted commercial travellers database, which doesn't actually exist yet. The driver's identity can be verified as he crosses the border using his mobile phone, as well as using automatic number plate recognition in CCTV cameras. In the case of any suspicious crossings, Carlson recommends using mobile units, which can man the border to intercept them. So in brief, that's the technology. Some of this was trialled by Swedish authorities on the Norway-Sweden border back in 2003, but it was discontinued because it was too expensive. While we're on the topic, let's talk about the Norway-Sweden border, which some people have suggested could be used as a template for the Irish border. Norway isn't an EU member, so it has two trade deals independent of the EU, one with the Faroe Islands and one with Greenland. Norway is in the European Economic Area, Schengen area, an associate member of the EU's customs policy group, and in a safety and security agreement with the EU. Basically, it's pretty close to the EU, and doesn't have any chlorinated chicken or anything like that coming into its market. Nonetheless, the Norway-Sweden border has 14 customs parks for commercial vehicles, and there are spot checks on non-commercial ones. This leaves Norway more aligned with the EU than many Brexiteers seem to want the UK to be, and it still relies on physical infrastructure, despite the high levels of trust between Nordic and Swedish authorities. Anyway, back to Carlson. It's definitely an interesting paper, and if you want to be overwhelmed by acronyms and feel stupid for 48 pages, then it's worth reading. But it still requires CCTV and mobile units manning the border, even assuming all the tech works flawlessly. That's still physical infrastructure. Nonetheless, Carlson has given hope to some Brexiteers like Sajid Javid. With the aid of Border Force officials, a month ago Javid drew up a proposal based on Carlson's paper, using technology used on the Swift border. And this proposal leaked to the Telegraph. The proposal included the same stuff we've just described, but also suggested using AI to identify suspicious vehicles, sensors to check that the right things were in the containers, blockchain technology to secure information securely, and inbuilt internet capabilities to track vehicles. However, the proposal admits there are a couple of minor problems with these technological solutions. Firstly, it's not going to be ready until 2030 at the earliest. And, as the proposal notes, the government does not have the strongest track record on delivery of large tech projects. That's at least another decade of the UK staying very much aligned with the EU. Secondly, according to the government, there is currently no budget assigned to this, and it will be very expensive. Thirdly, it was never meant to happen. It requires the cooperation of 28 government agencies and a myriad of interconnected existing and planned IT systems, and agreement and commitment from Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and possibly the EU. Amazingly, these are all quotes from the last slide of the government's presentation. If you want to take a look, we'll leave a link down below. But this isn't just Ramona propaganda. This was a proposal from a potential Tory leader, pitching the Malthouse Compromise to the pro-Brexit membership. If anything, he's got an incentive to oversell it. And if this is overselling, then you should get a sense of how hard this would all be. Anyway, as the proposal admits, even if the technology was there, it still requires political will from all sides for it to happen. The EU and the Republic of Ireland have made it clear that they're not interested, and every constituency on the border with Northern Ireland is Sinn Féin controlled. And as Irish nationalists, they're definitely not interested. The EU aren't keen on this, because they think it would undermine the integrity of the single market. The light touch technological solutions proposed aren't exactly watertight. They rely on the EU granting exemptions to all small businesses on the border. The EU worries that this will make smuggling really easy, which means you'll probably end up with stuff that doesn't meet single market regulations and hasn't had the proper tariffs applied, making its way into the single market. The Irish objection is much more fundamental. They're predominantly worried about the violence that will arise if physical infrastructure and border patrol units appear on the Irish border. If you'd like to know any more about the history and possibility of Irish nationalist violence, again, we're going to be covering that in our video on the Good Friday Agreement, so just hold out a bit longer for that. So that's the Irish border, and why technological solutions are, at least for the moment, not really possible. They will still require some physical infrastructure, they might trigger some violence, and there's not political will for it. We're planning to do 2 related videos, the one I mentioned on the Good Friday Agreement and how it relates to all of this, and one on the backstop and the border in the event of a no deal. Tell us if you're interested in those topics, and like this video and comment below what you'd like to learn. Also, make sure you're subscribed so you can find out when we post these videos. You can also follow us across our other social channels and get exclusive content and articles by searching for TLDR News.